All right, we're going to take a trip back in time to 1963. We're diving into a landmark legal battle, one that really changed the game for the balance of power in India. This whole thing was a showdown that put the very idea of Indian federalism on trial.
So, what was this all about? Well, it all boiled down to one massive question. Can a national government just take property from its own states? I mean, think about that. It's a huge deal, right? It's basically national interest versus a state's right to its own stuff. And you know what the Supreme Court of India said? They came back with a pretty surprising answer. A big, loud yes. Can you believe it? That one word, it shook the very foundation of state power. So how on earth did we get to that point? Well, let's meet the two sides of this fight. Okay, so our story really kicks off with a head-to-head clash. In one corner, you've got the central union government, and in the other, the state of West Bengal. So what sparked this whole thing? It was a law called the Coal-Bearing Areas Act of 1957. And this act basically gave the central government the power to just acquire land that was rich in coal. Here's the kicker. Even if that land was owned by a state. Now, as you can imagine, West Bengal, a state with a ton of coal, was not having it. They decided to fight back. So you had two totally opposite points of view. West Bengal was all about states' rights. They were basically saying, hey, Parliament can't just take our property. It's our land, our rights. But the Union of India, they came back saying, oh, yes, we can. The Constitution gives us that authority, and we need this coal for the good of the entire nation. But you see, this whole fight, it wasn't really just about coal. It went way deeper. It forced the Supreme Court to tackle a huge, fundamental question. What does federalism actually mean in India? Okay, so West Bengal's whole argument rested on this idea of, let's call it, traditional federalism. They pictured India like the United States, a bunch of sovereign, independent states that all came together to form a country. And in that kind of system, the states would keep a lot of their own power and couldn't just be pushed around by the central government. But the Supreme Court heard that argument and just completely shut it down. They did it with one single, incredibly powerful sentence from their ruling. The states have no separate sovereignty. Wow, I mean, that just blows West Bengal's entire case right out of the water. So the court basically said, look, India's constitution wasn't built like a traditional federation. Instead, they argued it created a system with a really strong central government, what you'd call a unitary system. And you got to remember the context here. This was just a little over a decade after the incredibly painful partition of the country. So for the people who wrote the Constitution and for the court, national unity was everything. They built a system where, at the end of the day, the central union government has the final say. So, with that interpretation in mind, how did the court actually reach its final decision? Let's break down exactly what they said in the ruling that pretty much settled this debate. The court laid it all out very clearly. Point 1. The big ruling, yep, the union can take state property. Point 2. Why? Because states aren't sovereign. They don't have that ultimate independent power. Point 3. Where does this power come from? Well, it comes right from the Constitution, specifically something called the concurrent list. Now, this is a list of things that both the central government and the states can make laws about. And guess what's on that list? Acquiring property. So the union had the right all along, which leads to the final verdict, that Coal Act from 1957, totally legal. So here's the real takeaway. What the Supreme Court was saying is that when the union government needs to acquire property for a national reason, it doesn't matter who owns it. A state is treated exactly the same as any private person or any company. There's no special shield, no immunity, just because the property is owned by a state. Now, this decision was made way back in 1963, but its impact is huge. This wasn't just about one law or one piece of land. It left a legacy that is still shaping the relationship between the central government and the states in India today. What did it do? Well, first and foremost, it basically cemented a power structure that leans heavily, and I mean heavily, in favor of the central government. It was the legal stamp of approval on the idea that in a lot of key areas, the union government is supreme, and that has fundamentally shaped India's entire political landscape ever since. And on a more legal level, it set a massive precedent. What that means is, after this ruling, states couldn't really challenge the basic right of the national parliament to pass these kinds of laws. The whole argument that Parliament wasn't competent to take state land, that door was slammed shut and locked. And that brings us right back to today. You still see these debates happening all over India. fights over resources, over taxes, over who has the final say. So it really makes you think, right? How does this one decision from over 60 years ago still play a role in that constant tug of war between the center and the states?